Actually, in 1958, I, along with everybody else in the United States, was interested in Zen Buddhism, and there was a lot of articles about it and early books by Alan Watts, and I borrowed a book at the Detroit Public Library on Zen and psychotherapy, and I was reading it while I was walking down the street in Detroit, and I came to the instruction, imagine somebody has asked, how are you? And they mean it. And you scan your body and your environment, your thoughts, your feelings. And he said, that's meditation. Well, I was walking, and maybe because of that, I tried the experiment, and suddenly I went into a kind of beginner's enlightenment, which I could step behind my consciousness and look at everything that was going on, my thoughts and my fears and my preoccupations. And I went into what I now call the witness state. And I could do that for the next 3 months. Totally changed my life. Ended up writing my dissertation on Zen. And in that 3 months, I discovered that I didn't have a body, I was a body. In other words, I had what I now call a body epiphany. So it was a massive, massive experience for me. I could go to the dentist and not let him use Novocaine because I'd rather just observe the sensation. So many things became apparent. So I completed a dissertation on the topic of Zen meditation. I did an experimental study with a few eager engineers. You know, humanities students didn't come to be volunteers in that study. It was mostly physicists and engineers. Go figure. And years later, I was invited to go live at the Esalen Institute because of my publications, and I was looking for body-oriented methods of psychotherapy. What I had discovered about the body, the nature of the body, was that it was very wise, and that it was a key to psychological evolution. So I was looking for body methods. And Esalen was the ideal place to be looking for them. And I encountered a woman who was then, I believe, 73. This was 1967. Named Ida Rolf. She'd come to Esalen to Rolf Fritz Perls. And many of us heard about her, went down to the baths and signed up for a 10-session series. It was $15 a session. And so in the fourth session, she was working on my adductors and my left thigh, and it hurt so much that I had to go back into the witness state in order to deal with it. And I thought to myself, well, anything that can put me back into the witness state is the body method I'm looking for. So I asked her to train me, and she was just at that time beginning to form small classes. In those days, she did a 10 series on every one of the practitioners in the class. And the first class there were 3, the second class when I was a practitioner there were 4 of us, and we each got the 10th series again. Now, the way I imagine my Ida Rolf, she was a very spiritual person with a very great deal of light in her eyes, but she was not a particularly interested in the subjective experience of the people she was working on. She was a material scientist working on a physical body, and she could see what was needed, and she went in fast and accurate, and it sometimes hurt like hell, but it was over in a little while. She thought that pain was an essential part of the process, and the most compassionate thing she could say was, "Stop resisting." Well, her early students were not fast and accurate, and we really hurt like hell. And Rolfing got a reputation for pain. Today, if you say you're a Rolfer, somebody's, "Oh, I hear that hurts." And my answer is always, "Yeah, but it hurts good." So clearly, her early students were causing too much pain, and something had to be done about it. We had to improve our touch. And one of the really interesting phenomena that came up was that in the pain sometimes morphed into something profound and even pleasurable. I didn't know about this, but she didn't focus on it particularly. If there was an emotional release, she was respectful, but she didn't ask questions about its meaning. She was not a psychologist. In fact, she thought that most of the stuff of psychotherapy could be changed by organizing structure. Or what I heard her say was, insecurity is often insecurity in gravity. So that was where it stood. Now, Dr. Rolfe knew that her method had many, many, many different aspects, and that there would be many schools following her, and she originally hoped that the Rolfe Institute would be an umbrella organization that could umbrella many different schools, some emphasizing psychology, some emphasizing spiritual consciousness, some emphasizing anatomy and physiology, some emphasizing whatever other aspects. In fact, when she conveyed her name and intellectual property to the Rolfe Institute, there was included in that agreement a codicil that said that if they did not arrange for a way for other schools to be under that umbrella, there would have to be a fee paid to her heirs. That was never really implemented, and it's unfortunate because the widely scattered nature of the field of structural integration at this time is really because that agreement was never kept. I want to propose something that is an emphasis in structural integration on awareness, that the awareness of the body worker and the awareness of the client in communication are the main element producing change. Now, this is my formulation of it. It's by no means unique. What I saw Nilsi and Simon doing yesterday is very, very similar to what I'm calling touch to know. Many of you, I heard somebody else at the conference refer to subtle touch, and this is all in the same ballpark. I'm only offering the formulation that I've used, come to use through the years. That focuses on awareness. Now let me define some terms. Consciousness in English was first used by an English philosopher named John Locke. And by it he meant the part of your mind that you can be aware that you're aware of. Consciousness is everything that's in your field of consciousness now. You know that it's there. Whatever you're aware of, that's consciousness. But the term awareness is much, much wider than consciousness. If you will agree that any form of reactivity that can be demonstrated in the body implies awareness, then awareness has many, many different levels. Awareness is involved when hormonal changes make electrical changes in your nervous system that make changes in the way salts are conveyed across cell walls. It has so many levels of physiological functioning that you wouldn't want to be aware of conscious of it all. Layer after layer after a layer of response is going on in your body. But the most superficial layer of your awareness is your sensory experience. And you can turn your attention to the sensory experience and focus attention on it. I wanted to say that what we call consciousness is very much a verbal consciousness. What you're conscious of is also part of a process of explaining things to yourself in words and concepts. Whereas this broader definition of awareness doesn't involve verbal conceptualization. It involves being. You are present to your sensation. You are present to the beating of your heart. You are present to the circulation of your blood. You are present to all these deeper and deeper physiological functions. But we have the possibility of engaging with the outer layer of body awareness, which is the sensory layer. Attention. Attention is this capacity that we have to direct our awareness, our consciousness, toward anything in the field of awareness. It is probably the only thing in our entire lives that's even free to a limited extent. It's highly conditioned, and yet it can be guided to a certain extent by your will. That's really what meditation makes use of. You develop the muscle of maintaining your attention where you want it to be. If you have any doubts about the limitation of your freedom in this regard, you can notice how hard it is to maintain that focus over a long period of time. Still, we can direct our attention toward in a certain way towards certain things in the field of our consciousness. So then we come to the idea that we have two minds. We have a relative mind of conceptualization and thought. It's what we call consciousness. And it's very much identified with our ego, our socially conditioned identity, our sense of separate functioning. And then there's another mind, which we could call the absolute mind, which is all these layers of awareness and response in the body. Now, this can be brilliantly intuitive. I wouldn't say that it's always accurate. The body is responding to the world it thinks it lives in. The body may be tremendously formed in its responses by trauma. Trauma can condition it to create ghastly illness, but it is not a conceptual process. It's not verbal. It is actually growing out of the experience of being. Pure experiences of being are pretty rare. We call them words like samadhi, satori. Being is so inaccessible to conceptualization that we return from these experiences not having words for it. These experiences are ineffable. But we don't have to be having radical experiences of pure being all the time for it to be a resource of our body therapy. Now, we early Rolfers were causing so much pain because we thought that we were producing change by the mechanical force that we were applying to somebody's body. I bet you thought so when you started working. That mechanical force is your tool for making the body change. I heard somebody remind me here at the conference that Dr. Rolf used to call in her son, Richard Demerly, when she had a particularly difficult body to work with and get him to push harder to get the change. But you see, I think awareness makes the change. She came to Esalen to work with Dr. Fritz Perls, who had originated a method of psychotherapy called Gestalt Therapy. Do you have that in Europe? Gestalt Therapy? Well, he was a marvel to watch with somebody. He could so track the evolution of these forms that would come up, and he would monitor. First this would come up, and then this would come up, and then this would come up, and he'd simply feed it back. His maxim was, put your attention where your awareness is, and the next gestalt will take place. In other words, if we can put our attention on what is, there's a natural change in the situation waiting to happen. He also said, don't push the river, it flows by itself. Well, obviously this can be applied to body work. And gradually over the years, I've come to take a fairly radical position. I like to pretend that I'm not touching a body. I'm touching awareness in the body. It's at first a difficult idea to apply. Of course I'm touching a body. But if I look deeper than that, if I imagine not only the physical form that's there for me to poke into, but that there is a sentience, a sentient being in the tissue, I will go to the barrier. Wherever you touch somebody, if you go in a little way, you'll encounter a natural barrier. If you try to push past that barrier, it's very likely going to be painful. But if you go to the barrier, maybe even back off a little, and wait, you'll find that the barrier begins to respond. The barrier will soften and melt. The barrier will draw you in. The barrier, if the body trusts you, will show you what it wants. So here we are in the possibility of a dialogue in the tissue. Now, I saw Nilsi and Simon doing this yesterday. It's not unique to my theory. I'm only giving particular words to the method. And this is the way I teach my students. You know, the hardest thing with students is to get them to pay attention to what they're sensing rather than what they're doing. It is so hard when somebody is learning a contact to get them to pay attention to the body and not to what they're struggling to do. You've encountered this. So the whole strategy is to fall back on what can be sensed rather than what is to be done. Technique, we say, follows perception. The body worker's awareness, I call it touching to know. My strategy is not to make something happen, touch to make something happen, but to touch to know. Know what? Know the feeling of the tissue. Know how the tissue is responding. Know the energetic flavor of the tissue. Know whatever is to be sensed about the being of the person. To know even the little pictures and intuitive flashes about their lives, and even sometimes their past lives. The imagery that comes up while making the contact. Touching to know. And what are my tools when I'm touching to know? There is touch, and there is pressure, and there is the movement of bones. Now, if you put your hand anywhere on your body, anywhere, you can be in the hand feeling the body, or you can be in the body feeling the hand. And if you're in the body feeling the hand, how deep does the touch go? If you're in the hand feeling the body, how far into your hand do you get information from the body? Just touch is this profound circulation of energy. Touch does not only occur on the surface. It's a flashlight. Next, if you press a little, you get a different kind of information. If you press, you see where the barrier is. And the third thing, moving bones. Do you have many people who've studied the Trager Method? Are you familiar with that in Europe? Well, Milton Trager evolved a marvelous kind of body work which involves kind of rhythmically moving the body so that very, very, very deep patterns of tension, deep to the bones, become apparent. So this movement, not stroking the surface, but moving the body so that the holding at the bone level becomes apparent, is our third tool. Nilsi, with her model yesterday, was moving the knees back and forth, right, to find the limit, to see what was happening there. And the very act of doing that was bringing awareness into her model's body. So touch and press and movement are our exploratory mode of consciousness. It's very receptive. So in that respect, our technique is very yin. Not every aspect of our work is yin. We're very yang in one respect. We are imposing a conceptual scheme. We know that if we can put geometry into the bones, if we can balance joints, we can bring the body closer to its ideal relationship to gravity. And this is, we all know, what are the two major unique characteristics of structural integration? We know that there is an optimal relationship to gravity, which involves the body's expansional reflexes in the core level in response to having a floor to stand on. These wonderful children running around here with their necks totally straight have toddled long enough for their feet to extend down to the ground, and that straightens their necks up into the crowns of their heads. They're a marvel to watch. They're structurally integrated in gravity, only to lose it, of course, which is where we come in. Got to earn a living somehow. So this is the first very powerful conceptualization that structural integration has, that there is a model of being in gravity. This is not relieving muscles here and there. This is not releasing. This is organizing in gravity. And the second thing is we have a principle of organization. If we hold things where they're supposed to be, and this includes bones and the soft tissue around them, and ask for movement, then the soft tissue will alter to support a new balance around that joint. And then when we get into integration, we can do the same thing to support a new balance between many joints until we have produced an expansional balance in gravity. I wish we had a little bit more time to do a walking exercise in this demo. Till, I'm sorry, I'm going to go an hour over. So we are very young in our the conceptualization that we are imposing in our work, but in pursuit of that, we are very yin in our openness to what's happening in the body. If we wait at the barrier, something will begin to emerge which we can follow. Unwinding is a good case of this happening in the body. So what do we want? What do we want from the client? I have 4 steps for training a client to participate. Well, my clients are not allowed to go to sleep. The first step is pay attention to the contact. Pay attention to my hands. That's something that the ego can do. The second step is draw me in. Now, some people have to be carefully trained to do that. I just said, draw me in like a sponge or a magnet. Imagine a space that you can pull the hands into. Want me to be there. It's still an act of the conscious mind. But the third step, we're going onto the other side, into the body awareness. The third step is pay attention to pleasure, if any. Is this interesting? Does it feel good? Once in a while there are those little salty moments of what one writer calls sarcal pleasure, fleshy pleasure. Like scratching an itch feels good. Like releasing deep, deep tensions feels delicious. And if a person is paying attention to that pleasure, they are sitting in the middle of their body being. They're there. This is the one we want to talk to. Pay attention to pleasure. Now, this is a crucial step for a psychotherapist, because lots of people can't do it. Lots of people are incapable of pleasure. Pleasure has gotten confused in their mind with something naughty. You know the old joke about Calvinism? It's the terrible fear that someone somewhere is having a good time. Spain is an interesting trip. Visited Philip II's bedroom up in the Escorial. Very puritanical. I bet he would have had a hell of a time finding the pleasure in Rolfing. He would have liked the pain, perhaps. So, if somebody is dissociated in the body, the difficulty finding pleasure is your opportunity for working with dissociation. I've had runners, not particularly good runners, who were so committed to the principle of no pain, no gain, that they couldn't find the pleasure in the Rolfing. And it's a big cue that somebody is not in their body if they cannot find this pleasure step. And the fourth step is use my hands to organize your body. As structural integration people asking for movement, we're suggesting various geometrical movements of the arms and the legs and the torso to approximate this expansional balance, this reorganizing of joints. And so they already have a beginning repertoire of movements that we're giving them, but there's a step beyond that, when they're using those movements to interact with our contact, to draw us in, to make the pleasurable change that their bodies know they want. You see where this comes together? Suddenly we have a creature-oriented being using our hands to organize themselves. I had a workshop in Japan in April, and it's basically an introduction to structural integration, but several of the people in that workshop had taken it more than one time, and one was a chiropractor, a man who was a chiropractor. First time he took the course, we met in a train station on the way up to the venue, and he bowed to everybody and presented his cards, very, very formal. And this time he arrived for his third version of the workshop, and he said he was here to learn this receptive touch. And at the end, he was lying on his side, and I had my knuckle on the margin of his spinal erectors, about the middle of his thorax, and he was extending his elbow forward, and he got totally into the spirit of using my hands to organize his body, and he produced a major change in his breathing pattern in his thorax, something very, very deep, which I could not have approached simply with my force. He had to find it. He had to use my hands to get into that place. And after that, he was completely melted. At the end of the workshop, he said he couldn't look at me without bursting into tears. This is not your typical Japanese chiropractor. So that's the fourth step. We're training a client to use us. We're giving the client access to their own deeper body being in order to be able to do that. So at this point, we have encouraged a presence in the body, in the present moment, that is nonverbal. I want to say also, getting back to the mind of the body worker, what you imagine is what you touch. I have encountered trained structural integrators that are so caught up in fascia that they seem not to have bones. I've encountered other structural body workers and I've suggested that surely bones and fascia are two of our most fundamental concepts, and they replied, no, they don't think of bones, they think of fluid volumes. I don't know what kind of body work they get out of this. A lot of tears, maybe. You guessed which method, right? But what you imagine is what you touch. If you're imagining viscera, you will touch viscera and your client will feel viscera. If you are imagining bones and the geometry of skeletal movement, your client will discover that. It is this very yang imposition of your imagination is terribly important in getting results. So I propose, I was very, very happy to hear Saul talking about mindfulness. I think that what I have to propose is a practical scheme for doing this, for producing clients who are aware in the body, in the present moment, and we are leading to that mindfulness joint by joint, limb by limb, until it falls together as a whole. I'm sure you've all had clients who, after the very first session, have gone home and had huge epiphanies. I had one Dutch college student, very ungrounded, spiritual kind of boy, just as spiritual as he could be, no feet at all. And he was walking home from my office, and he was in the park and going across a bridge, and he had a big epiphany. He just had suddenly discovered his being in the world. Really, a very major experience for him. So this is how we produce the ability in our clients to be present in the body in the present moment, which is the unification of the relative and the absolute mind. We need our relative minds. We have to be able to explain the world to ourselves. We will not get home to Madrid if we don't have an ego so that Annette can drive the car. But we need a relative mind that can make room for the invisible, for the part of our experience that cannot be represented in words and concepts. There has to be a space. This is how artists receive inspiration. This is how intuition comes. We have to make room for something to be delivered out of the dark, out of the void. The void means void of thought. And then I wanted to, just of late, I've been thinking a little bit more about this business of core experience. I came across an article about Wilhelm Reich. And Reich had the idea that there was an outer layer in our body psyches, which is dealing with the outside world, but it's also our phony persona, our performance, our self-identity, and it involves all kinds of things that we don't want to think about ourselves. And then there's a middle core, which he equated, there's a middle layer, which he equated with Freud's unconscious, or id, the lust and aggression that is not representable to the ego, and which is the stuff of psychoanalysis. But then he had the idea that there was a core of pure life. It was the center in which love can occur. It's the permanent abode of love, in another writer's words. The permanent abode of love. It is the essence, the center of being. It is the the source of real work. And that core was the goal of his psychotherapy. Now, Freud had nothing like that core. Freud did not theorize about any such core. He had an id and an ego and a superego that was telling the ego what to do, but he did not have a belief in this blooming, bubbling source of pure life. But he was a pessimist. All you have to do is look at those two children in the breakfast room today, one of them being a real difficult little thing, and he was the source of pure life bubbling up in him. It was just a marvel to watch. And that's what we all have inside. And Reich thought that you had to take an enormously combative role. You had to break down the armor to get at the unacceptable affects in order to make room for the core. It was violent and dramatic. But I think, first of all, I don't think we're dealing with the kind of egos that he was writing about in the pre-World War II German ego. I think we have a different situation in modern psyches. But also, I think that as body workers, we've demonstrated that there is a softer, more gentle, more elegant way to access that core. And that I think that the path, some such path as I've outlined, is a way to do that. And such is the blessing of our work. Thank you.